Back in chapter 2, the writer has been talking about God creating a new family in Jesus. In order to achieve this, the Son, who is above the angels, must descend to the level of humans and take on their flesh and blood and their sufferings. In this way, he is able to make atonement for them and defeat death and the devil. The result is that we become his brothers and sisters, part of the heavenly family. Here in verse 17 of chapter 2, the writer says that the incarnation of Jesus was necessary for him to become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God. These two words, merciful and faithful, are then explained in reverse order, beginning with chapter 3, verse 1. But just before that, he adds one final verse emphasizing that because Jesus was tested by what he suffered, he is able to help those who likewise suffered. It is not just of theological importance that Jesus became like us to make atonement. It serves the author's pastoral point for his audience, who in their trials are considering reverting to Judaism. Chapter 3 then takes up the quality of faithfulness in Jesus' role as apostle and high priest. Chapter 5 now describes his merciful qualities as high priest. Actually, our section really begins near the end of chapter 4, from verse 14 onward. The final verse, verse 16, gives an exhortation which sets the theme for what is to come. In fact, the author will unfold a magisterial vision of Jesus' ministry from here all the way to the end of chapter 10. But he begins here in chapter 5 by setting up a comparison with earthly mortal priests. The author, even though he does not want his hearers to backslide into Judaism, is not at all critical of the priesthood or the sacrifices. His point overall in Hebrews is that they have been completely surpassed. That, as he wrote in 1:1, God has spoken in the last days by his Son. Something different and final has occurred. So his procedure, especially in the following chapters, is not so much to find fault with the priests and the cult, but to demonstrate, as Paul does with the law, that they were provisional. They served their purpose for a time, but their incompleteness pointed forward to a time when the complete version would be given, and the central role they played in the life of the people of God would be obviated. The position of the priest, as 5:1 describes it, is venerable and much needed. God has given his people this mediator and set him apart. The author makes 3 points about him. He is gentle with the ignorant and wayward, because he himself is weak. 2, he must also sacrifice for himself, given this shared weakness. And 3, a priest is appointed by God. The author immediately addresses this last point and shows that Jesus was appointed a high priest as well. He now uses 2 psalms to link together Jesus as Son and Jesus as high priest. This powerful combination shows the overwhelming supremacy of Jesus as God's salvation given for us. The second quotation from Psalm 110 establishes that Jesus is a high priest from the line of Melchizedek. This is from verse 4 of that famous psalm, and it only appears here. When the psalm is quoted from elsewhere in the New Testament, it is verse 1 which is used. He repeats Jesus' priestly lineage in verse 10, but it won't be until chapter 7 that the author fleshes out what this means, when he compares the priestly order of Aaron, which is mortal, to the priestly order of Melchizedek, which is indestructible. But the author at this point does not want to emphasize power. Instead, he wants to emphasize weakness and suffering, which gives us confidence in Jesus' mercy, as he knows all too well what we go through. The language of verse 8, which speaks of learning obedience, and of verse 9, which speaks of being made perfect, seem to suggest that Jesus was at one point not very obedient and not perfect. But we shouldn't take the language at face value, especially because already in 4:15 the author has pointed out Jesus was sinless. And in the chapters to come, he will make much more of Jesus' lack of need to sacrifice for himself. The point the author wants to make is that Jesus' obedience and perfection are not theoretical or merely theological. He proved them by a lifetime of obedience and suffering and real testing in the flesh and blood which we now share with him. So Jesus voluntarily gave himself to an experience of obedience and faithful living, and it is this experience which makes him our true high priest and mediator on our side. His nature as the Son makes him the mediator from the other side, from that of God. At verse 11, the pastoral tone re-emerges as he is aware that he is wading in deep waters. He is critical of their lack of maturity, as Paul was of the Corinthians, though not to condemn, but to exhort. They ought to have made more progress in their training as disciples. They are characterized as milk-drinking infants who ought to have matured and be taking solid food, meaning progressing beyond the basics of faith. It is not about acquiring masses of knowledge and becoming highly sophisticated in theology, though this author clearly is. It is about being able to distinguish good from evil, as he says in verse 14. Their inability to understand even the simple things of their faith is not a problem of intelligence, but a commitment to faith, which is shown now by their backsliding. If they had been training themselves in the truth of the gospel, they would not have been deceived. If they had understood more clearly who Jesus was to them, they would not be considering abandoning him.